I bring you greetings from Ghana, West Africa, to be precise. And we gained our independence somewhere in 1957. And we were under the colonial rule, that is the British, that is the imperial power. And since 1975, we have been dominated by the British system of ruling. I'm setting this space because most of the African countries or sub-Saharan Africa, Ghana was first to gain its independence. And it will interest you to know that before the colonial masters were in, we were administering our own criminal justice through deterrence and restitution or reparation, which was hinged on what we call community justice, or what we call community-based restorative justice. After a while, when we realized that we signed a bond, which is popular, and most of you are aware, the bond of 1844, which gave the British the administrative power and ruled the country, we naturally picked it up to that extent. However, between 1828 and 1842, the British Committee of Merchants introduced the English criminal law, what we all know to be the common law, in our jurisdiction and established the first ever prison in our country in 1841. This came to replace the form of compensation and other forms of criminal redress that Ghana was used to or known under the name Gold Coast. It will interest you to know that when the first prison was established in Ghana, 87 convicts were in the famous Cape Coast Castle. And at the end of the day, the authorized capacity for that cell was 69. This means that overcrowding in Ghana prisons started at the very inception of colonial prison policy. That was towards the punitive action and not restorative and transformative justice. And finally, I must say that we inherited about 32 prison establishments from the colonial masters with an overcrowding rate of 48%. And currently we have about 43 prisons or facilities, which 3 of them were purposely built. The rest were other castles and 4 that were converted into prison in itself. Now let's look at the effect of some of this mandatory detention. We are looking at high sentences and harsh sentences, financial burden on government. We are looking at concentration on offenders and not victims, and lack of technology as the world evolves. And so if you look at the picture in front of you, an authorized capacity for one of the biggest prisons in our country, which is 851, currently holds 2,979 inmates, and that significantly shows exactly the impact or the effect of mandatory detention in our country. Now let's look at the subject of today, which is paving the way forward for 2045. We are talking about some recommendations that the UN and other stakeholders may have to look at. And we are giving you some of them as best practices that Ghana have tested and have come out successful. When we were somewhere in 2007, the congestion rate was, and the overcrowding rate was somewhere around 52%. So the state, together with civil society, came up with a perfect partnership with a project called the Justice for All program. That is an mobile in-prison special court to adjudicate remand cases. And as I'm talking with you, we go to the prisons, as you can see on your screen, and then we have to adjudicate cases. And then, as you can see on your screens, adjudicate cases, and then you realize that 72-year-old man, for example, called Zorukuta, after spending years on remand, had his freedom, and another person, just for the charge of assault, spent 9 years and then had to also be granted a bail, and others were discharged. Next slide, please. And so you can see the impact of this to be replicated in other jurisdictions. What we think it should be called a model to decongest Africans' overcrowded prison. The next slide, please. You will realize that we have been able to reduce the remand or pre-trial population from 33% in 2007 to 12% as of September 2020. And that is what we're talking about here. When we bring gender, we're looking at female to male in terms of ratio of imprisonment is about 87-1. That means in Ghana, a lot of men are in prison rather than females. In short, we say that Justice for All program, if we are trying to look at curbing mandatory detention, we need to look at those already in existence and how we can take them out. And so the Justice for All has been solving the dilemma between crime control and due process, and can be considered as a model to decongest Africans' overcrowded prisons. And we've also introduced technology. Next slide, please. We will also note that some people have been convicted already. And so we need to come up with other programs. But before we move to that one, COVID plays an important role in the administration of justice. And so it couldn't let us sit as Justice for All goes to sit in the prisons. But now we are fortunate to announce to you that there is going to be a virtual court session approved by the Judicial Service of Ghana, and it has come the next to assist us in that breadth and to reduce the number from 12.5% downwards. Next slide. We have what we call the in-prison paralegal program, a project that can be that was picked up from, let me say, Kenya, called a prison program. This one, those who have been convicted already are asked to appeal on their, or to represent themselves. And so we train inmates and officers as paralegals to help them appeal on their matter and then receive justice. This woman was sentenced to 11 years imprisonment for drug offender charges. And after 4.5 years, the program took her out completely unacquitted and discharged. Now we move to the next one, where you realize that alternatives to sentencing or to incarceration have been mentioned by my colleagues. It will interest you to know that during COVID, with funding from OSF, and we've been able to get the government and draft a bill currently called the Community Service Bill, which is about to be sent to Cabinet for consideration. We also have sat last week with the prisons and about to activate a CI, constitutional instrument, to regulate and activate parole in our system, so we can talk about alternative sentencing. The next, which is one remarkable thing I want to applaud civil society and stakeholders, is the drug policy law that has been passed, which was passed in on March 20th, 2020. That is the Narcotics Control Commission law. This is coming to seek to address the drug use as a public health and human right issue, which is very significant. In other jurisdictions, we are dealing with drug as a color. Here, we are dealing with drug as poverty. So you can see from the quote in between the post. The next one, which is very critical outside the box, is that we have been able to help, next slide, COVID, we have been able to help the prisons to be able to also assist in the prevention of COVID in our prisons. So we can go next and say that we donated PPEs and then trained officers and inmates to be able to handle the COVID situation in our country. Next slide. And I must end with the COVID one and say that up to date, in the history of our country, we have not recorded any single case of COVID-19 in the prisons of Ghana as a result of prisons. Finally, let me go to the last point, which is the recommendation by the part 2, which is the final 2 slide, please. The next slide. We are thinking outside the box and proposing solutions. We need to go back from the history I gave you before the colonial masters came in. Where and how were we living? We were living in our own way called the Sankofa. The next slide, please. No, before this slide. Yeah, no. Please just backwards. That point is very critical. It's called the Sankofa. Yes. the animal, sankofa, meaning go back and pick what you have forgotten. We had our own way of living based on our values and principles. The court will always give rulings, but when our traditional leaders were resolving matters, they based on principles and values to resolve matters, which was through deterrence, restitution or reparation, hinged again on community-based restorative and transformative justice. With that, we are able to coexist. There is peace and there is stability and there is safety in the system. A typical example is where there is a big issue, there was a big issue in Ghana conflict, and the government did not resort to the court, but rather recalled chiefs to sit in to bring redress to the solution. And as I'm talking with you now, there is a lasting solution and there is peace and there is no chaos in this chieftaincy institution. So I'll leave the slide with you as I end. And then when we get to the questions, we will pick it up from there. But one thing that we need to hammer is that as Africans, we had our own lives and our own way of living. Can the UN and stakeholders research into our way of living and resolving matters in order for us to be able to blend that kind of criminal justice and the present criminal justice to be able to have a lasting solution to avoid mandatory detention in our country through deterrence, restitution, or reparation as a result of the work that we do?